Pioneer brand canola with Optimum Gly, the highest yielding glyphosate tolerant trait on the market. What's next in canola happens here.
You're listening to Ruminating with RealAg, the podcast that chews on the latest in beef production, with your host, Amber Bell.
Hey everyone, I'm your host, Amber Bell, and this is Ruminating with RealAg. Today, I'm really excited to have with me Barry Yaremcio with Yaremcio Ag Consulting. Barry is a ruminant nutritionist and was raised on a mixed farm in northeastern Alberta. Not only does his education come from real life experience, but he trained at the University of Alberta. Barry has spent many years working with Alberta agriculture, and most recently it was as a beef and forage specialist, where he provided advice to farmers and ranchers on cattle nutrition, forage production, animal management, and more. In 2020, Barry went independent. So today we're actually going to be talking about cattle nutrition throughout the winter. We're going to touch on water quality, feed quality, and what cows and calves going into what wintering strategies look like. So welcome, Barry.
Thanks, Amber. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. So we're going to start this off talking about a new term that I heard this year for the first time, although there's been a lot of producers have been doing this for a while, but called outwintering. So when compared to our normal feeding in pens or in a feedlot, just getting them out on the landscape. Have you heard of that term? And, can you speak into that a little bit?
It's a newer term, but the process of keeping cattle out on dormant grazing or stubble grazing, stockpiles, grazing, bale grazing, grazing on corn or other annual crops, that's been going on for a few years. And some of the big advantages with that is, one, you don't have to start a tractor and spend money on diesel fuel. And two, when cows go ahead and drop their manure and urine in the field, you get a 40% higher nitrogen retention compared to hauling manure out of a dry lot pen. And three, if the cows are dropping the manure out in the field, then you don't have to spend for cleaning out the corrals in the summer.
There's a lot of benefits.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And 40% higher nitrogen, that's amazing. And how much of that can the crop the next year or the pastures actually use? Like, what's the usage of that?
The typical breakdown of that nitrogen or use of that nitrogen is 25% in the first year, 50% in the second year, and 25% in the third year. So it has a long-term effect on soil fertility.
Wow. Okay. So we can pretty much jump right into that then, because I've done a fair bit of work with bale grazing, that type of thing. And we do see, and it's anecdotally, but we do see definitely a lot of growth for up to even 10 years after that. So when doing that type of feeding, though, I think one of the things that stops a lot of producers is the idea of, okay, well, the nutritional requirements and then wastage, right? So let's speak to the nutritional challenges. What would be some of the nutritional challenges of outwintering? Like, what would be some things producers need to be looking out for, to plan ahead for?
Generally, outgrazing or outwintering is done with mature pregnant animals. So their nutrient requirements in late pregnancy, for example, is 9% protein on a dry basis and a 60% TDN value. That'll keep the cows in condition and will also ensure that the digestion of the feed is being done properly by the rumen bacteria and microorganisms, and they get the nutrients out of the feed. If there's shorter protein, then the digestion rate goes down. The amount of nutrients extracted from those feeds is down because the fiber is not being digested completely, and possibly resulting in cattle losing weight.
So do you find a lot of producers are going out and feed testing? And can you speak into sort of that feed testing part of that? Especially, I mean, it's a lot more controlled, of course, you have if you have them in a pen, but if you're doing, let's say, swath grazing or something, do you find most producers are taking feed tests ahead of time?
The new Canadian cow-calf management survey that they're just about ready to release, they're saying that someplace between 75 and 90% of the producers are feed testing. And
That's
the
amazing.
ones that do feed test, uh, a lot of them, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but a large number of producers use those feed test results to decide what they need for supplementations or minerals and get them made appropriately or purchase what is on the floor if it works for them. But yes, they're paying attention to make sure they don't have any troubles with milk fevers, downer cows prior to calving.
Right. And what would management look like in some of them? Let's take silage, silage grazing or something of that nature. What would management look like? What are you looking for when the herd is out there, when you're walking through the cows? Especially if it gets cold. I mean, we get -40 here for a week or two usually. So yeah, what are you looking for?
If the cows are satisfied, you should be seeing them laying down at various times of the day and not continually grazing or picking for feed. Their biggest meal is first thing in the morning. There's a second meal mid-afternoon, and a third one towards evening. If they're laying down and chewing their cud, that means they're content, they're happy, and everything is going well. The second thing I look at is the manure. If you see the manure is reasonably flat, with the way a cow pie should look, everything's good. There's lots of protein, the feed is being digested. If you look at it and it looks like a bunch of onion rings, that means there is a marginal amount of protein going into the animal. And if it piles up like a pyramid, then you know you're definitely deficient. So they can't talk to you, but if you watch them, your behavior and the manure, you can get a pretty good idea of how they're doing. Third thing is uh, look at them, see if there's a good amount of flesh covering the short ribs on the right-hand side of the animal, and that's from looking from the behind. If there seems to be a little bit of a triangle showing up and a concave appearance, that tells me they're losing weight.
Okay, so you're really watching for that body condition score when you're out there.
Absolutely.
And if you see a body condition score drop, at what point would you be like, okay, I need, like, let's say it's not the whole herd, it's one or two animals. At what point would you say, yeah, you know what, let's pull this one out?
If you see the condition of an animal dropping, it usually is an indication that those animals have lost someplace between 100 and 200 pounds of weight. It's not visible to the eye until that actually happens. So pulling them out, putting them back in a pen with the replacement heifers, or if you've got a separate pen for them, feed extra grain and get those animals back up to condition before calving.
Right.
It makes a huge difference in reproductive efficiency.
Hmm. That makes sense. Are there ways that, you can kind of judge before going in? If you're looking at a cow, you're going into winter, it might be, you're putting them on a new type of feed source. Is there a way that you can kind of judge ahead of time, like, hey, this one might not do so well on this?
Typically, before being put out on winter pasture, a lot of cows receive vaccinations of some type.
Hmm.
So if they're in the squeeze, open up the bars and use your hand on the short ribs to see if it is uh, relatively smooth or not sharp to the touch. Then you know that animal's doing okay. If there's big indentations between the short ribs and short to the field when you go up and down over the ribs or across those four ribs, then you know that's a candidate to not put them out with the rest of the herd.
Great. That's really useful. And then, so how would you decide at what point throughout the season, so say the whole herd, you're seeing they're not doing so well on it. At that point, what decision process would you go through to say, hey, maybe we should be adding some protein or some supplements? And how would you decide that?
If you start to see the entire herd dropping in condition or not being uh, content out in the field, I know of managers who take silage to supplement the bale grazing or swath grazing or whatever system they're using to increase the energy and the protein content in the feed that these animals are consuming. So once every 3 days, they go out, feed 4 or 5 pounds of grain, add in some extra barley malt sprout pellets or a pound or a pound and a half of 32% supplement. And that extra protein will last about 2 to 3 days in the rumen. So it will uh, get the effect that you need to improve intakes and improve digestibility. So you have to do something while they're out on the pasture or out in the field grazing so that they don't lose condition.
Hmm. How much of a difference can an access to fresh water source make in them losing condition throughout?
Water is critical. If they do not drink enough water, they cannot consume as much feed. It does not get digested as quickly. Therefore, they don't meet their nutrient requirements. The other thing is interference of nutrient absorption with water quality is a big concern, especially in these drier years where dugouts aren't flushed during the summer or in the spring with the runoff. You get an accumulation of total dissolved solids, all the other minerals in there as well. And the two that I really watch out a lot for is sulfur and sodium. Sulfur, if your levels get too high, combine that with the sulfur in the feed, and your total sulfur content is more than 0.4%, then you've got the potential for having problems with polio and dead cows. When you have sodium contents in the water over 300 parts per million, that provides enough salt to meet the animal's requirements on a daily basis. So having them consume free choice mineral out in these situations with that high sodium water, their intake is going to be very, very low. So a lot of times what happens there is to eliminate the extra salt that typically is in the minerals, take it out completely, put in some wheat mids, wheat distillers, or some other product that's palatable and desirable by the animals to increase their free choice consumption, and that typically takes care of the problem.
That's great. I think it was BCRC. I was reading something on their site and talking about how depending on what the water nutrients are, that can really reflect like certain specific micronutrients that the cattle aren't getting. And that was something I didn't know before, so it's
Yeah,
interesting.
the big thing with the sulfur, along with polio, is sulfur and molybdenum tie up copper. Copper deficiencies, typically you can see that visually. If you've got a red or a black animal, line the animal up between you and the sun and look along the flank. If the tips of the hair will look orange in color and not black or not red, that's a poor man's indicator that you've got a copper deficiency.
Oh, wow.
And if you're short of copper, you're typically short of the other trace minerals as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is interesting. And do you find that during winter that's more of a risk? Because I know we're running on, depending on what water sources we're using, they typically change in winter feeding, especially if you're outwintering. Have you found that there's more nutrient deficiency during winter, or is it an all year round?
If you're using dugout water, the problem is year round.
Okay.
Shallow wells, Typically, they have more problems with high total dissolved solids and contamination compared to something that is 400 feet deep or 300 feet deep.
Okay.
But it all depends on the area.
Mm-hmm.
It can vary from east to west, north to south. There's no rhyme or reason for water quality. It depends on the aquifer that you're getting into if you're looking at a well situation.
So testing is really key in any of that.
I recommend that if you're feeding cattle and you have not tested your water previously, do so. It's quite amazing to see the variability even within wells from the same farm within a 2 mile radius. So
Wow.
it's important. It's really important to do that.
Hmm. Okay, and then we were talking about the other thing that sometimes will stop a producer from doing some of these outwintering strategies, is the idea of wasting feed. Can you speak into that a little bit and what some of the ways around that are? You said there was 40% more nitrogen, so is that enough to make up for that wasted feed?
Two things to consider when you're looking at wasted feed. One, nutrients from that feed that is not consumed does get worked back into the soil as nutrients as well. But it's an expensive way to do it. Uh, if you're unrolling hay out on a pasture field so you don't have to haul the manure out and you're just unrolling it on the ground, you get about 13% waste. If you're running with a bale processor and putting it on the ground, you will have 19% waste. Bale grazing, Lakeland Applied Research Association did some work up at Bonnyville, and they found a minimum of 20%
With bale grazing.
with bale grazing. Same thing will happen. I don't know if there's anybody that's done the work for swath grazing. I would expect it to be the same, but controlling access of the animals to the feed is key. Same goes for corn grazing. Use a electric wire, portable fence to limit their access to enough feed for 3 days. If you see there's a lot of material that's wasted, reduce the area that they're getting. If you
Hmm.
see it's completely cleaned up after 2 days, then you have to increase the size. So controlling what those animals have to walk on and lay on and just waste is a good way to reduce your costs.
Right. So bale grazing, one of the things that we saw was there was a drastic increase in water holding capacity in the next year. So if those bale graze fields hit a drought or something like that, then that waste actually turned into a spot to hold water. Um, do you know if there's been any studies done on kind of if that makes up for that 20% waste?
Yeah. Work done at the Tremundi Research Station probably back in 2008, 2009. They measured forage growth from areas that were bale grazed and those that did not get it. The pasture or the land with no bale grazing produced about 2,200 pounds of dry matter per year. Where they had the bale grazing in place, yields went up to 5,500 pounds per year. And they attribute that to two things. One, the thatch on top of the ground from the wasted material keeps soil moisture levels down, and it also prevents the evaporation by wind of the moisture. So it acts as a barrier for losing that moisture. So it may look ugly for a little bit, but after in the second year after the bale grazing event, the grasses come back. It comes back with a vengeance, and you can just see it when you're driving by the fields where the bale grazing was and where it wasn't. There'll be a foot and a half difference in height, difference in color. Definitely something that's an advantage in the long term.
Definitely, and that's handy. And I know even when you were speaking about having that 3 day window, when we would do that, we would usually on that third day go and unroll a bale or give them a little bit extra feed, just to increase that and have an even plane of nutrition, basically, so that it's not dropping. Can you speak into that a little bit?
That's especially true for situations where you're grazing corn, because the first day on a 3 day rotation, the cows will take the cobs and the leaves and the tassel. Second day, they'll clean that, pour it up, and start eating the stalks. And the third day, all they've got left is the stalks to clean up, basically. And
Right.
corn stalks are lower in quality than barley straw, oat straw, wheat straw.
Wow.
So if you reduce that amount of protein received for 2 or 3, 4 days, that's going to reduce their ability to digest the feed and have the animal take in that next uh, portion or paddock until they get the protein levels back up. Then they can start digesting the feed. So that third day, throwing out a bale of better quality hay or some good silage, uh, definitely worthwhile doing.
Right. Are there a lot of people that are using protein tubs or something of that nature in that way as well?
There are a lot of protein tubs being used. Two things to look at: what is contained within that tub, uh, what's the protein content, but also you'll find that the calcium, phosphorus, magnesium levels, for example, are relatively low in those products. So you'll probably have to still put out some sort of mineral in those situations. Second thing is, with free choice tubs or free choice any product, you never know which animal is eating how much. So you might have one cow taking 3 times as much as it needs. The other might be a number of them that don't come up to the tub at all. But overall, that tub disappears in the right period of time. So you really don't know what's happening there. The other thing is, evaluate the costs. What are you paying per pound of protein for a tub versus other products? Is it economical to use? So
Mhm.
it's buyer beware when you're using those tubs.
Right, that makes sense. And then another question I have is there has been a lot of talk about cover crops right now. It's fantastic to see all the like crazy mixtures that people have growing. I was out on a field that had corn with a wider spacing with I think a 16 different seed mix in between. It looked beautiful. But can you speak to kind of the nutritional value of what you've been seeing with some of the cover crops and some things just to look out for, the pros and cons of them?
Usually the cover crops, they've got a blend of various species and they all typically have good quality. Uh, the ones that you need to watch out for: sorghum Sudan grass, if it's in the mix. If the cows are eating that material when it is still green, the sorghum Sudan grass is no different than flax. They have prussic acid or hydrogen cyanide in the leaves. The best way to do, or excuse me, the best way to graze or use that as a swath grazing material is the plants have to be brown. If it's green, the prussic acid is still there. When it is brown, then the prussic acid breaks down and it's not a problem. The other thing with the brassicas, they typically are a sulfur accumulator, no different than canola. So again, the feed test, having your sulfur levels done to see what they've got may save some problems with polio and copper tie-up.
Okay, but overall, it's a pretty good,
Oh,
solid option.
It's a very solid option. It's just being careful with a couple of these things. Some of the other species in those cocktail mixes, they might have some nitrate accumulators in there as well. So uh, caution is the best word. I'm not saying don't do it because it's effective, it's uh, cost efficient, and saves you a lot of work. So it's something to look at. I'm not poo-pooing the idea.
Right. And then would it be better then for some of those, does it change if you silage it instead of grazing it?
When you're silaging a cover crop, the material is younger or less mature. Your protein levels are going to be higher. You should get higher energy density in that silage crop as well compared to something that's more mature and used for swath grazing.
Right. So silaging might be worth it if a producer goes and does their numbers on it.
Yeah.
That's great. And so are there, going back to the feed waste question, are there ways that you would recommend for producers to sort of reduce some of that feed waste, while also maybe improving that feed efficiency at the same time?
Restricting access is one.
Yeah.
Second one is if you have run out of swath grazing, but you want to keep the animals out on pasture so they don't have to come into the yard. Using a bunk, a feed bunk of some kind, uh, something that made out of drill stem, 30 feet wide, or excuse me, using drill stem, 30 feet long, 4.5 feet wide, 18 to 30 inches tall, depending on the type of processor you have to deliver the feed. If you can put it inside that bunk, your feed waste goes down to zero. And that
But
was
then you're also
research.
still not getting that layer of protection for the soil, like we
No,
talked about earlier with the bale grazing.
no, you don't. But
Hmm.
if you're going on to a place where you've got a lot of corn stover left on the ground, that'll give you a lot of soil coverage on that annual crop. For perennials, it's unfortunate, but you've got a choice. Either get the soil protection by the trash or the material that's been wasted, or reduce the
The
amount of
feed
feed that you have
efficiency.
to deliver. It's where's the economics? You got to figure that one out for yourself.
Right. Can't always have your cake and eat it too. Are there any specific micronutrients or vitamins that are particularly important during some of the colder months, especially when we hit those, minus 30, minus 40 days?
I'll take care of the vitamins first. When a crop is cut by 6 months after harvest date, most of the vitamin A and vitamin E precursors have oxidized, and most nutritionists do not rely on any vitamin contribution with hay or after that period of time. For silage, during the fermentation process, all the vitamins are destroyed. So once you start feeding silage, you have to supplement 100%. Minerals, once they're in the feed, they are stable. But the problem is most of the soils in Western Canada, we know they're deficient in selenium, iodine, and cobalt. That's a guarantee, 100% supplementation for them. Copper, manganese, and zinc, depending on soil type, those can be any place from 50 to 75% deficient. So if it's on pasture, if it's swath grazing, corn grazing, or feeding out silage or other ingredients, always supplement your trace minerals. It's it's not if it needs to be done. For example, cows that are out on pasture with a blue salt block versus a fortified trace mineral salt with selenium, there'll be 25 pounds differential in calf weaning weight
Oh,
just
wow.
by changing the type of salt. And
That's
then
amazing.
and then there's the impact on reproductive efficiency. If the calf's gaining more weight, that cow's going to be typically in better condition as well because she's eating more and getting more out of the feed. That'll help her reproductive efficiency the next year.
That's incredible. And what about if you are feeding cows that are not pregnant or cattle that are, if you're feeding some backgrounders or, how do the nutritional requirements change and how would it change if you're doing some of those outwintering methods?
Outwintering methods for calves generally doesn't work that well because the amount of heat that those calves lose compared to how much they can produce from the feed that they're consuming is not enough to keep them warm. So they're always under a cold stress situation.
Hmm.
So average daily gain, feed conversion efficiency on those smaller animals is much better in a dry lock pen.
Okay. And what would you consider a smaller animal? So at what point do you think, like if you're going in with maybe some open heifers or something, as opposed to what would be that breaking point?
My guess on that would be something with something in the size of about 900 pounds or more.
Wow, okay. That's bigger than I expected.
Yeah, but just a guess. I
Hmm.
haven't read anything as to what the actual number would be, but by that time they're eating quite a bit of feed and they should be able to keep warm.
Through it. Okay. Yeah, that's definitely different. I didn't know what you would say about that one, and it's unexpected, but that makes sense. It really does. Um, so do you have any tips for feeding cattle during some of the more extreme weather events? So if you're getting, we know there's a snowstorm coming in, or a really big cold snap. Is there any tips you can give producers for those times?
If you know that a cold snap is coming, if you are feeding some grain to the animals during the warmer periods, start increasing the grain content a couple days before the storm hits. That way they're producing more heat, they'll be able to withstand the cold temperatures. Cows can resist temperatures down to -20. That's the thermal neutral zone. Colder than that, the animals cannot produce enough heat by digesting the feed to stay warm. So you have to provide a higher quality feed to them. Yes, they do increase their voluntary feed intake when it goes up, but for every 10 degrees below -20, you have to add 1 additional pound of barley per head per day. So at -50, you're feeding an additional 3 pounds a day and allow them to eat as much of good quality forage as they need, not increasing their forage intake and relying on them to eat more straw. That does not work. You have to maintain that protein level so they can digest that feed during the cold weather. Straw will just, with 405% protein, that slows down the digestion rate. They can't eat as much and they lose more and they can't produce as much heat. So on the other end of it, when you're coming out of the cold snap, start reducing the grain a couple days before the warm snap hits. Because if you don't, what happens is those cows are still producing that amount of heat. They don't lose as much. They're going to be under heat stress and they're going to reduce their voluntary feed intake.
Hmm. I think I've seen the most death losses at the end of a cold snap. Usually they're fine going through, and then if we're gonna have problems, it's usually right at the end once it warms up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I heard once that there's a certain temperature when cattle will no longer bother walking to water because it takes more energy to walk to water than it does to sit there. Is that a thing, or is that like even with feed, is there a temperature point where they'll stop? Um, they just stop using up energy. Basically, they try to preserve what they have.
The first line of defense for cattle is they will eat as much as they possibly can to keep warm.
Hmm.
Walking for water, maybe instead of going once a day or once every 2 days, they may try to stretch it out a little bit more and go once every 3 days. The other thing that they'll do if they don't want to walk for the water is they will consume snow.
Right.
And Dr. Young's work at the University of Alberta found that even in cold weather, cows consuming snow for water do not have an increased amount of energy requirement because the heat of fermentation and the melting of that snow does not detract for what heat they have at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe they're not walking, maybe they're eating snow instead.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Um, so, and then how does a proper winter nutrition program influence the next grazing season as you're coming up? So we already spoke about more nitrogen maybe in it, but if you're coming out of winter with, well-fed cows, what does the next grazing season look like? Is there areas maybe you might be able to push them a little bit more depending on economics? What have you seen with that?
It it's partly dependent upon when the calving season is and when the bulls go out with them. If you're if you're calving out in January and February and the bulls are being put out in April and May, uh, March, April, May, excuse me, then the nutrition program should match what the animal needs. And then by the time they go out on grass, they will just consume the normal amount.
Mm-hmm.
If the calving season is in, say, June and July, you'll find that those cows will eat a lot and put on any place from a pound to a pound and a half of weight a day before calving. But you have to keep them in great shape because if a cow loses condition between calving and breeding, you'll lose 20 to, you'll have a delay in conception rates and you could have up to 30% open cows.
Wow.
The trick to evaluating your cow condition and feeding program is you should see cows cycling 60 days after calving or one cycle before the bulls are turned in. And that tells you you're doing a good job and you'll have a high success rate.
That's great and handy. And then one of the wintering techniques that we didn't talk about was stockpiled grazing. So is there anything that changes with that? Because I know quite often there's some producers that'll use their riparian areas, some of the lower areas, and they'll stockpile those grasses that might not have as much nutritional value in them. So is there anything that people should be looking out for if they're planning on stockpiling?
Stockpile forage in the riparian areas and lowlands typically is less nutritious than, say, a barley green feed. Again, watch the cow condition, watch the manure.
Mm-hmm.
That a lot of that low grass hay really doesn't have enough to support that cow, especially if it's fully mature. Stockpiled tame hay or situations where they went ahead and took the first cut of hay and baled it up for their winter feed supply, left the regrowth, and it's at the heading stage or maybe at the flowering stage. That is very high quality forage, and cows will gain very well on that material. So if your cows are coming off pasture a little bit skinny, wean early or a little bit earlier than normal, put them out onto the stockpiled forage and try to get them back up into condition before the cold weather hits.
Okay. And with the nutritional value, how much does it change if you stockpile, say you are in that flowering stage a little more early? How does the nutritional value change that versus swathing it? Like, what are the advantages or the cons to that?
If you cut the forage and use it for swath grazing instead of stockpiled, over the winter, the quality loss from the swath, there will be a little bit, but if you leave those plants standing from fall to spring, you could lose 3, 2, 3, 4% protein. 5, 6, 7 points of TDN. It's just the weather damage and that causes the problem. In a swath, a lot of the material is protected and doesn't experience the weathering damage that you would have with a standing crop.
Okay, so swathing, if depending on the economics, of course, swathing might be a little better if you're going to be doing it, grazing it later on in the winter rather than earlier on.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. And do you have any words for producers as we go into grazing this winter and maybe planning for even next winter at this point in time?
If your cows are a little bit on the thin side, wean the calves. Calves that are over 160, 150, 160 days of age have a fully functional rumen. Put them onto a grain hay or grain silage ration. They'll do just as well for gains compared to leaving them on the cow. The advantage there is your nutritional requirements of a dry cow versus a lactating cow is 25% less. So give her the advantage to gain weight before the cold weather hits. A thin cow will take 1,400 pounds of additional hay just to stay warm compared to one that is in good condition. And at 10 cents a pound, that's a big chunk out of your profit margin by feeding that extra hay to keep that cow going.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you. And where can people reach you if they want to get a hold of you? Because you do consulting.
Best, there's two ways. Phone number is 403-741-6032, or preferred would be use my email address, bjyaremcio, that's YAREMCIO @gmail.com.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us, Barry. It was great seeing you again. And that was Barry Yaremcio on Ruminating with RealAg.